Earlier this week, Eric Bischoff was on the Pancakes and Power Slam podcast. And on that podcast, he mentioned his Mount Rushmore. And on his Mount Rushmore, he said he would include Hulk Hogan, Vince McMahon, Ric Flair, and Stone Cold Steve Austin. Obviously, 4 people you can easily put on the Mount Rushmore of wrestling. So, Ralph, I will ask you, who would you put on your Mount Rushmore of wrestling?
Right. So my list is actually very similar to Eric Bischoff's. So first off, I would obviously have Ric Flair for the obvious reasons. He's one of the pioneers of the wrestling industry, a guy that was just way ahead of his time in terms of the promos he was cutting and the things he was saying. And of course, not only did he develop that character being the Nature Boy Ric Flair, larger than life, but he delivered in the ring. And he did that on a consistent basis more than, I think they were saying, certain times it was 7 days a week. So he did this, not only was he able to deliver in the ring, but he did it throughout the week, always on the road, always representing the industry. So definitely got to go with Ric Flair just based on his ability to cut promos, his personality, and his ability to deliver in the ring. Next up, where my list was different than Eric Bischoff's, I actually had Shawn Michaels rather than Vince McMahon. I think Vince McMahon, you can easily put him on a Mount Rushmore of the wrestling industry, but I just stuck with strictly wrestlers here. So HBK, Mr. WrestleMania, I mean, you can look at all the long laundry list of all of that, his accolades and accomplishments within the industry. His ability to perform at WrestleMania is probably what he's most noted for. Outside of that, and we talked a little bit about this last week, DX, that was a huge faction back during the Attitude Era. So Shawn Michaels would be the second guy that I would have. Next up, I would certainly have Stone Cold Steve Austin, probably the biggest guy in terms of the largest peak within the wrestling industry and what he was able to accomplish, especially in I guess you would consider a short amount of time. When WWE was not doing so well and it looked like they were going to go under when competing against WCW back in the Monday Night Wars, it was really Austin who who was the one who took the ball and ran with it. His character, once he cut that promo after he won the King of the Ring, that was it. It was like the next day, it was he was a star. That's what made him that one promo and then obviously becoming what he was, Stone Cold Steve Austin, larger than life, great character, some really good matches with The Rock, some really good feuds with the corporation. Of course, everything he did with Vince McMahon, just pure money. And last but not least, I do have Hulk Hogan on there. I've always said that I think Hogan is a bigger star than Austin because when you look at his body of work, when Austin turned heel, it didn't necessarily work. It didn't click with the fans. When he was kind of the head of the WCW, when WCW was feuding against WWF back in the day when they did the invasion angle, it didn't really work. The fans didn't understand it, and they kind of rejected it. Where when you look at what Hogan did, Hogan was obviously huge in the 80s and early 90s as, the All-American, the red and the yellow. There was nothing bigger than that. When he noticed that people were starting to turn on him and he wasn't necessarily as popular as he once was, maybe arguably the biggest faction of all time, the NWO, being able to create that, reinvent himself at that stage in his career, there's not many guys that can do that. And there's not many guys that can do it on both ends of the spectrum where you're the biggest face, arguably the biggest face of all time in Hulk Hogan, and arguably the biggest heel and villain as Hollywood Hulk Hogan. So that, to me, would be my 4 guys, Hogan, Austin, HBK, and Flair.
Now, my criteria for my Mount Rushmore is these are the 4 guys that, whether you're a diehard wrestling fan, a casual wrestling fan, or have never watched a wrestling match in your entire life, you know who these 4 people are. So with that, my 4 are Andre the Giant, Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, and The Rock. Now, you could put really anybody on this Mount Rushmore of wrestling, depending on what your criteria is. But I guarantee you, I could show you a picture of Andre the Giant, and you will know exactly who he is. I can show you a picture of Hulk Hogan. You will know exactly who he is. I can show you a picture of Ric Flair. You know who he is. I can show you a picture of The Rock and you know who he is. Because the things that they did both in and out of the ring have hit mainstream measures. Andre the Giant, for just his size alone, was just a big attraction in the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s before he passed away in 1993. You already talked about Hulk Hogan and Hulkamania in the 80s, the NWO in the 90s. And even today, whether it's good publicity or bad publicity, Hulk Hogan is still talked about. Ric Flair, whether it was his work in the 80s with Crockett Promotions or WCW and his stuff in the 90s in WCW and WWE, and his career just lasting forever and being that basically the Keith Richards of professional wrestling, where his lifestyle, you would think he died at 25, but yet here he is almost pushing 70 and he is alive and well. And his mainstream status, you have people in the locker room of NFL games doing the woo. You have rappers doing rap songs about Ric Flair.
Ric Flair drip.
Yep, Ric Flair drip. And of course, everything with Charlotte Flair now in wrestling, how that story now comes in, that now there's a second generation with Charlotte Flair. And of course, The Rock is The Rock. Everybody knows who he is, whether you know him as Dwayne Johnson or The Rock. You know him as probably the busiest actor ever. And yes, you could say, well, The Rock is popular for his acting, not really so much his wrestling. But if it's not for his wrestling, his acting career doesn't happen. And
right.
And Andre had an acting career. Hogan had an acting career. Maybe not Flair, but it's hard to, for my criteria, it's very hard to knock anybody off those four. When you say, I could show you a picture of these guys and you know exactly who they are.
And I understand your criteria. The thing that I would disagree with is if this is strictly, a Mount Rushmore of the who's who of wrestling, it's hard for me to not have Stone Cold Steve Austin on that list. And I think most people would have him on the list, but
I agree with
your
that.
criteria. So,
but with Stone Cold Steve Austin, obviously the diehards know who he is.
Everybody knows. If you're a wrestling fan, you know who Stone Cold
If
Steve
you're a
Austin
wrestling fan of some capacity, you know who Stone Cold Steve Austin is. But if I were to go to someone who's never watched wrestling in their life and I showed them a picture of who Stone Cold Steve Austin, they might not know who he is.
Well, they might know The Rock as Dwayne Johnson. If you showed somebody who doesn't watch wrestling.
But he was acting under the name The Rock. And he did Saturday Night Live as The Rock. And he did things as The Rock. And then switched to Dwayne Johnson maybe 5 or 10 years into his acting career. So I don't think it necessarily means that no one will know him as The Rock or Dwayne Johnson. If there's other people that maybe you could take off of your Mount Rushmore and put on there, are there some honorable mentions in the Mount Rushmore?
Now that we're talking about him, I went back and forth whether to include The Rock or not. I chose to put HBK over him, not because HBK was more popular than The Rock, because I don't think he was more popular than The Rock, and I think that's kind of confirmed based on The Rock's ability to draw at WrestleMania, his ability to perform in the ring, and T-shirt sales and all of that. But Shawn Michaels, to me, I gave the nod over The Rock only because of his ability to perform. Wrestling is an artwork, and there was very few people that you can even put in the category that you can, put Shawn Michaels in. So The Rock would certainly up there. Vince McMahon, an argument can of course be made for him to be up there. Outside of those guys, The Undertaker, that's somebody I considered as well, because just that character alone. I mean, however long he's been in the WWE, playing that character in a time where you have social media, the wrestling fan is a little more wise to understanding what's going on, and everybody accepts that this is staged, and he's essentially playing a dead man. Being able to still make that work this day and age for all those years, that's certainly impressive as well.
I would agree with The Undertaker that might fit into my criteria. If I show you who he is, you might know, regardless of your affiliation with professional wrestling. HBK, obviously, to me, that's my favorite wrestler, and far and beyond the greatest in-ring performer in the history of professional wrestling. Better than Flair, better than Bruno, better than The Rock and Austin. He is the best in-ring wrestler.
In your opinion?
In my opinion. But I think he just fails with, again, that test of, if I were to show you a picture of Shawn Michaels, does the non-wrestling fan know who he is? Like, they would know The Rock, they would know Ric Flair, they would know Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. The Undertaker, I think, could pass that. I just don't think he's more popular with people than an Andre the Giant or a Hulk Hogan. Granted, I could take one of them off and put Undertaker on and people would agree with me. Is there anybody today that maybe 10 years down the line you might put there?
The only one I would consider would be John Cena. And he comes up a lot, and I praise him a lot, and I say this all the time. I'm not even a big fan of his. I was always critical of him in his younger career. But again, talk by your criteria alone, can somebody recognize him outside of just the wrestling fan base? I say yes to that. Has he been able to deliver quality matches on a consistent basis? Of course. And again, a laundry list of accomplishments. He's a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame. So if anybody, John Cena.
I would agree with John Cena. In fact, when I first told you my Mount Rushmore a couple days ago when we were going to talk about this, I originally had Cena in my Mount Rushmore.
Yeah.
And then last minute, I switched with Andre simply because of the fact that you talk about the Andre the Giant documentary. That documentary really opened my eyes to the career of Andre the Giant.
Of course, yeah.
When I first started watching wrestling, it was at the tail end of Andre the Giant's career. So my sample size was very, very limited. And when you take that into effect, you obviously, watching that, you have to put him on there because he was larger than life. And he was an attraction, not just in wrestling, just anywhere he went. Right. You just knew who he was. And for that reason, you have to put him into your Mount Rushmore.
And the impressive thing about Andre and even Flair is, again, I touch on this quite a bit. This day and age with social media, if you're a star and you have a personality, it's very easy to transcend that out to the world. You can tweet something, you can put something on Instagram, you can put it on Facebook, WWE can link it on their Facebook, and it's exposed to millions and millions of viewers all around the world. When Flair and Andre were trying to come up in the industry or when they made their names for themselves, all you had was word of mouth and reputation. So they'd literally travel all over the world and they'd have to, deliver in the ring and promote for themselves, and being able to get over to the extent that they were able to get over in a time where you didn't have the internet and you didn't have social media and you couldn't just reach out and connect to millions of people. You had to bust your ass on a consistent basis to be known. And for guys like Andre to be able to do that to the extent that he was able to do that, and Hogan and Flair, that's impressive in itself. Because again, wrestling is all about personalities. A big portion of it is about personalities. And, Ric Flair being the nature boy and Andre being able to be the attraction that he was just based off the limited ways that he could gain exposure. That's impressive.
If you'd like this segment of the Squared Circle Psychobabble, listen to the full episode by clicking the link in the description below. And make sure you subscribe and review on your favorite podcast provider. Hit subscribe and the bell for notifications for more videos. And follow us all over social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at SCPB Podcast.